Two international courts consider the gravest possible charges against Israel and its leaders. The war goes on and the hostages are still no closer to coming home. We'll talk to one of Israel's foremost experts on international law. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. You know, those days where British politics is your escape from reality. Says something. But quite interesting that yesterday you gave me a sort of heads up and said, I think we're going to have elections in July. And I'm like, It's May. How can you do that? We need at least 3 months when Knesset is in session. So I was quite amazed by that.
And also kind of, what, an election? You actually are allowed to have those? I mean, it's a role reversal, isn't it? Because there was a time when we were complaining that there were Israeli elections as often as, London buses, and they were coming all the time. Now, plenty of Israelis are just thinking, when is it going to happen? That there had been that feeling here in Britain for a long time, but it had to happen this year. And yeah, Rishi Sunak sprung a little bit of surprise. I'm sure the only pictures anybody outside this country, and even plenty in, have seen is the British Prime Minister announcing this in the pouring rain and getting drenched, his suit getting wetter and wetter. It was an anthem of Labour when they won a big landslide election back in 1997. Actually, the first of two landslides. The anthem was "Things Can Only Get Better." So there were pictures of Rishi Sunak everywhere with the caption, "Things can only get wetter," for him. But yeah, it's election season here. Kind of like I didn't already have enough to do, but that's a very, very narrow and parochial perspective on what, of course, is a wonderful democratic civic exercise that will consume the next 6 weeks.
Yes, well, we'll discuss the chances of an Israeli election anytime in the horizon. It's definitely not going to be in July. This we know, right? Because Israel needs 3 months minimum from the moment that the Knesset dissolves itself. That doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. We will be, as I said, discussing that later in our show. Look, I have to tell you that anything anyone was talking about in the last 24 hours in this country and beyond is the video that the hostages' families decided to release. Really harrowing footage of the abduction of 5 soldiers, female soldiers from the Nahal Oz base by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. This is footage taken from the body cameras of Hamas terrorists that day. Just to think, before we even get into what you see in that video, the dilemma that the parents themselves had to go through, seeing their daughters in the, most terrible moments of this and saying, we need to wake up. We need to wake up this government. We need to wake up the Israeli public. And we want them to see this, chilling 3 minutes and 10 seconds of terrorists. Really, one of the most chilling things about it is just how comfortable and, not rushed they feel. And Israelis have already seen the footage of hordes of terrorists in the Nova Festival site and in the kibbutzim. But this is a military base of the reportedly one of the most powerful armies in the world. And they walk around like they own the place. And sadly, for hours, they did own the place. And that is something it makes you, even the calmest people on earth, their blood boils when you just see the way they walk around there. They have time to pray, the way they treat these young women. It's a horrendous video. You have to see it. Everyone in the world has to see it, but it's terrible.
It is. Last week, I think it was, you and I were talking about that split screen moment where there was the official Independence Day ceremony and then the hostage families ceremony, and they spelt out through human formation the word abandonment. Well, that was one image of abandonment. This was a even more visceral and vivid evocation of that. These are, I mean, we must describe them as women because they're over the age of 18, but any parent watching it will think these are kids.
Teenagers. They're 18.
They're 18 years old. Then some of the reporting outside the country has always described them as soldiers. They're not armed. They're young women. They're girls
in the pajamas because this whole thing woke them up and they were sleeping on base. Right?
And so the first two, the two things that struck me, one is the one you've said, that we've talked for so long about the length of time the people who are under attack on October the 7th had to wait before the Israeli military came to rescue them. Long hours. We now see that, the sense they were abandoned for so long by a state and an army that was meant to protect them. You really see that. But the second element of that is that we talked very early on about why it was that the violence against women is so central to our understanding of October 7th. And I mentioned the historian who wrote to me and said, you've got to understand that violation, the sense of violation that Israel endured then, goes very, very deep. There is no more powerful way to evoke that than by the sight of young women who are, manhandled. They're bloodstained by these Hamas men. The line that appears is, one of the men says to one of the girls, "You are so beautiful." It's absolutely chilling. It's very, very hard to watch. But this brings home the sense in which Israel felt and was violated that day. And it is a very powerful reminder. It couldn't defend its most vulnerable. It couldn't defend its young girls and women. It goes absolutely to the sense that still powers this war. I think, unfortunately, this may be painful to hear for people inside Israel. I have to say, on the news in this country, partly because everyone was focused on the calling of an election, if it was shown in the bulletin for more than a second and a half, I would be surprised. It was fleetingly there, just to say this is what's making the news in Israel, and that is because. And I know so many Israelis are still psychologically in October the 7th. Outside, the rest of the world view is, we get it. It was awful. But actually, everything that's happened since is kind of worse because it's more victims and more people. I know that's painful for Israelis to hear, but that is, I think, where most world opinion is, where the world's media are. They are kind of like, we don't need to keep going back over October the 7th. We get that. We've moved on. And I think that's just one of the gaps between Israel and the wider world, which is relevant to what we're going to be talking about a lot when we come on to the actions of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and the non-reporting, the non-coverage of this very, very distressing video outside Israel is part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still very much, I have to admit, very much stuck on that image of those 5 young women. It's Daniela Gilboa and Liri Elbag and Nama Levy and Karina Arayev and Agam Berger. They had just seen Hamas execute, really, their friends. This is not on the video that was published. It does exist, but it wasn't published to the Israeli public. Another thing I would just mention is just how heroic they are after everything that they've just seen. And you see them trying to talk to the Hamas terrorists. Naama Levy was part of a program that connected Americans and Palestinians and Israelis. And she's saying to them, I have friends in Palestine. She's trying to talk to them. Liri Elbag is trying to say, does anyone here speak English? I mean, in the worst moments. And I can't get over the fact that they were waiting there for hours to be saved and to be rescued. And no one came. And then they're still waiting for 230 days. That's a lot of hours, Jonathan. And for this moment, I have to admit, I care less about what the world is showing of this. I care that they are still there together. They are 128 Israelis, and the negotiations over this are completely stuck we talked about this on the podcast as well, that Hamas set out conditions. Israel took a few steps forward as Hamas set out conditions that Israel can't accept. One of them mainly being the end of the war. We can get into why that is so problematic for the Israeli leader. But reports about the arguments between Netanyahu and one of the most important mediators here, Nitzan Alon, who's a retired general that's taking care of this issue and is deep inside the negotiations. So arguments there, and you're just saying, you look at these girls and you use the word abandonment, and that is exactly what it is. It brings home that feeling of how abandoned they are and their families are.
Yeah. Because they were abandoned on the day and they are still abandoned now. The families who had, as we've been saying, as you were saying, would have had to dig very deep to take the decision for people to see these pictures because they are so distressing. This is them banging the table, grabbing Israeli leaders by the lapels in desperation to say, as I have to say on a human level, I would say exactly the same, which is whatever deal there is, grab it, take it, do it, get them back. I don't care what the actual, the detail, the small print, how long you're allowed, just get them back. And that's what they wanted, I think, Israeli public opinion to feel and to put more pressure on. It is an act of desperation in a way to release and publish this video. Terribly, it's very, very upsetting to watch it.
Well, in the meantime, as I said, it is very clear that the Israeli prime minister does not want any phrasing of the end of the war. This is not, I think we should explain that Benjamin Netanyahu has been promising for almost 8 months a total victory. And that is what his supporters are expecting. That is what many people who aren't his supporters are expecting. And if he ends the war tomorrow, okay, and the next image the world sees is of Yichi Sinwar, the architect of this massacre against the Jewish people, leaving one of the tunnels in whatever, Rafah or wherever he is, and having this V sign in his fingers, then that is a death sentence politically for Benjamin Netanyahu, which he cannot afford. So this is where we are, and it's very much stuck on that point. Even what we have discussed a little bit and has become came into the foreground this week, the Saudi deal, right? And you have these reports about Sheikh Sullivan being worried that Netanyahu wouldn't want the wording of the Palestinian state. It's not about the wording of the Palestinian state, which can be as vague as or as clear as the sides want. It is about the fact that he can't afford, in the way that he has constructed this whole thing for almost 8 months, some sort of declaration that says the end of the war.
No, you have now an irresistible force, immovable object situation. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the reasons you've said, cannot accept any agreement that requires him to say the war is over, because then it's less than total victory. This complete delusion that there can be such a thing, already proven bogus, in my view, by the fact that in areas where there's meant to have been victory in the north, Hamas are back, firing off rockets again. So even in the places where you're meant to have won, it hasn't been won. But he needs that. He needs to be able to say it's not over. And Sinwar, on the other side, has to have it be over in order for him to, and his own position, to be secured. I don't see how you make those 2 points agree or converge. And so they can keep shuttling back and forth. And I've sent a delegation and there's talks in Cairo and fresh round and they're authorized until either Netanyahu is prepared to say the war is fully over, short of this total victory that he's never going to get, or that Sinwar somehow thinks his position is safe enough for to do a deal, even though he knows it won't be an end to the war. There won't be an agreement, and the pain of those families will continue. It's brutal that these 2 people and their political needs, in a way, are holding the entire country and everyone involved. And I would add in here the people of Gaza too. They're all held hostage by this situation because there can be no respite until one of them gives way. Look, to be clear, I'm not saying these 2 people are morally the same or they're on the same plane, but these are the 2 parties to this conflict or confrontation that has to be negotiated, and they each have their own competing interests, and I don't see how they can be bridged as things stand now.
So we're going to get on to talking about the ICC, which is the very big international story of this week. But we do need to say a few words about Israeli politics because that's what we do. So remember last time we talked about Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, coming out very clearly, really reprimanding the prime minister and saying, you have to clearly have a strategy here. You have to say that we don't have any intention to stay in the Gaza Strip, to have some sort of military rule there, Israeli military rule there. We have to be very clear that at the end game of this is some sort of rule of the Palestinians. And you asked, Jonathan Friedland, asked why it isn't actually the more opposition part or more moderate part of this coalition, which is Benny Gantz stepping out and saying it. Lo and behold, I'm not saying these things aren't connected. Benny Gantz did indeed come out on Saturday and say
so stung by that week's episode of Unholy. Coalition.
He couldn't leave it without a remark or a comment. He just said to himself, listen, Mr. Friedland, I want to say something to you. So, and to the rest of the Israeli public, of course. So essentially Gantz was saying, this is an ultimatum to the government, to Netanyahu himself. We're giving you 3 weeks to come up with this strategy about the war, how to topple Hamas, how to bring back the hostages, and how to solve the situation in the north. I'm reminding you there are tens of thousands of Israelis evacuated since the beginning of the war from that area. So this is Benny Gantz. An ultimatum of sorts. Definitely if you give 3 weeks, that's a period of time. And Netanyahu retorting instantly saying, instead of giving an ultimatum to Hamas, you're giving an ultimatum to me. The end of the story here is that Benny Gantz will have to leave the coalition anytime very soon. The result of that is not entirely dramatic because I remind you that Netanyahu still has a coalition of 64. So you will need five votes to topple this government. Just think of I'm sorry that I'm getting into the weeds of the calendar, but this session of the Knesset in summer ends at July 28th. If the coalition survives, the next session, which you can theoretically topple a government, is October 27th. I remind our listeners again, it's 3 months minimum for an election. If Netanyahu survives this session of summer, you're looking at elections not before March of 2025.
Yeah. Wholly plausible the way you've sketched that out, that could be what happens. And just think about that. Go back to the families of the young women in that video that we talked about at the beginning. The idea that the man in charge on October the 7th, 2023, whose decision-making left Israel exposed to that vicious, evil attack, still in power 18 months later in March of 2025. It's extraordinary to me that could be happening. And yet, in the way you set it out, completely plausible. He only has to cling on for a matter of a few weeks. And when we say cling on, it's not as if there's some huge challenge that could get him out of that, away from that 64 and fall below the 60 vote threshold for that to happen. And we talked about it last week. There would have to be defections from his own camp, from his own side. And I've asked again and again, in the dead of night, I wake up thinking, where are those people who are with, say, Yoav Gallant himself or others who just think, yeah, I know my job in the Knesset, my seat depends on this, my salary depends on this, but there is something bigger here. I am going to, shift and vote for the government to be toppled. It happened, with the Bennett-Lapid government. In the end, it was brought down by a couple of defections on their own side. That was enough.
Because the head of opposition was Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, because he's a brilliant political operator, and Gantz is just not. I mean, it's hard to question somebody who's doing well in opinion polls. Maybe that means he's politically quite savvy. But I look at him and think, these are basic things in politics. Why are you not putting pressure to identifying 3 or 4 people in the Likud who are either have a conscience or are somehow persuadable, and leaning on them? Watch the Spielberg movie Lincoln, where that great moral paragon Abraham Lincoln does not
read the book or read the Doris
Kearns Goodwin. Yeah, it's a good one.
We're giving you an option.
But let's assume Benny Gantz is pressed for time. Sit down one evening, watch the movie Lincoln. There, that great leader does not scruple to twist the arm, bribe, pressure, bully, cajole, whatever it takes to get the votes. And I cannot believe there are not people aligned with that project who are not camped outside the home of 3 or 4 or 5 Likud members who could crack and therefore bring down the government. I think, I'm told they're not doing that. And that must come down to Benny Gantz, who is a kind of Boy Scout politician rather than somebody who is used to taking the gloves off and playing hardball, which is the only game Netanyahu understands and is really good at.
Yeah, I'll put this lightly. There doesn't seem to be a Machiavellian bone in Benny Gantz's body. In a weird way, by the way, the video of the female hostages being abducted, which does again bring to the foreground the question of where was the military, which is the biggest, darkest question about October 7th. That, in a way, takes the heat off Netanyahu, because the more you ask, I mean, we're not questioning the fact that there's a catastrophic failure of the military intelligence, operational on every level. The more you talk about that, the less he's getting criticized for what happened. So theoretically, hypothetically, there is an option that elections are in March. Maybe by then, all of the commanders of the IDF, including the commander of the Shin Bet and the commander and the IDF chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, are all gone. But he's still there. That is completely a very plausible option.
Very much so. And you can imagine him saying it. We've cleared out those responsible and somehow still being there, Meanwhile, the big news, the dominant news about this story around the world came early on in the week with the request from the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, to the court to issue a warrant for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant on war crimes and crimes against humanity. I said right at the very start that these are some of the gravest charges possible. Meanwhile, the International Court of Justice is proceeding with its case of the ultimate crime, the most serious of all, namely genocide against Israel. This is huge that we're talking about this thing. In the ICJ case, it's about the country. In the International Criminal Court case, it is about individuals, the defense minister and prime minister, being subject of an arrest warrant, or at least a request for an arrest warrant. The first thing I would just say about it is that, early on in the war, you and I talked repeatedly about this thing of humanitarian aid. It was on my mind. I sort of became a bit obsessed about it. We talked about it a lot. It wasn't always that comfortable a set of conversations we had. But in a way, this is why I was going on about it, because what really strikes me about this, the request as written by Karim Khan, is yes, he talks about the conduct of the war, but most of the emphasis and the detail is on the question of humanitarian aid, which he alleges is the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And it's almost as if that was where the line got crossed. That is where Netanyahu and Gallant left themselves open to this. And, you remember I was kind of furious about it at the time because of the moral problem, the callousness of it, but also because it struck me as being not only immoral, but so stupid, because it was so needless and so avoidable that you didn't need to do this. And if anything, the big strategic play Israel could have done was to say, our war is not with the people of Gaza, it is with Hamas. And the way to make that slogan real and to demonstrate it was to, from the beginning, have a strategy for providing essentials, vital materials, food, medicine, and so on, water, to the people of Gaza. That would have put up in lights that Israel is not fighting the people of Gaza, it's fighting Hamas. Instead, there were statements from the beginning about total siege. There was rhetoric about denying the population of Gaza the basics, starving them out from ministers. And this is the result, that this terrible moment in Israel's history has been reached.
I think it's possible to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. One would be that this is a scandalous decision. And the other would be that Israel did itself no favors on the road to the ICC. It's scandalous because to put in the same box Sinwar, Mohammed Def, Ismail Haniyeh, the architects of the worst massacre against Jews since the Holocaust, who sent butchers to murder and burn and rape Israelis, and to put them together with the democratically elected leaders of a country that has an independent judiciary. I don't think it's coincidence that the United States and the Biden administration called this outrageous. Our friend, a friend of the pod, Amos Harel, wrote this week that this decision reads like he actually wanted to target Netanyahu and Gallant, but he didn't want it to appear as if he is not talking about Hamas leaders, so he bundled them up together. But the other half of what I said is the issue of Israel doing itself no favors. Now, my friend and colleague Dana Weiss, who we once had on the podcast, who's a diplomatic analyst and used to be a legal analyst, reminded me this week that Netanyahu was always very meticulous and very, very cautious when it comes to international law. He'd always have an advisor with him in the room. It was always something that he was thinking about. But Netanyahu of 2022 took on a far-right government and gave a man like Itamar Ben-Gvir really almost uncontrolled power. You can't do both those things together. You can't hold a far-right government and say, but I really care about international law, because you might find yourself in a position like he found himself unprecedentedly in front of the ICC. And then what he is saying is essentially the whole world they're full of anti-Semites. I'm paraphrasing, right? But everyone's an anti-Semite and the board is set against us. Well, statistically, you might be right. A lot of people are anti-Semites and the board is set against you, but that's precisely why you should be very smart. Now, Israel, what it tried to do, and again, we should remember this is a nation in shock and in trauma. It tried to say, just give us our hostages back. That didn't help. It could have said, we are taking up and conquering all of Gaza for 6 months, and the military is going to take care of all humanitarian aid. Not Hamas, not anyone else. Not UNRWA, that is essentially under the control of Hamas. It didn't do that either. I still think, and we'll hear Yuval Shany in a minute, Professor Yuval Shany, who's an expert on international law, talking about the case itself. I still think you can make that claim of myopic sight, of malpractice, of rage, many things. But to call Israel, to talk about it being evil, to talk about genocide, this is a separate case, right? The ICJ and the ICC, to talk about these crimes against humanity, and again, bundle them up with these murderers from Hamas, I think is an incredibly egregious thing to do. That being said, almost 8 months after the worst massacre that we can imagine, the fact that we are at this point is a diplomatic failure of the highest order. I think we can both agree on that.
I completely agree on that. And it's just about absolutely catastrophic mismanagement of this war. Some of it, as I say, so wholly avoidable. For example, the talking. The need to go into this over the top.
You can fire the ministers who are talking this way, by the way, yes. But he won't because of the coalition situation.
Because veto power is held by two Kahanists in the form of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. So you're subject to their veto, in effect. But talking about the language of total siege, and we're going, and here was where Gallant, I think, opened himself up in those very opening remarks, and he sort of said, no fuel, no food, no water, and so on. It'll be a total siege. Nothing will get in. You were going to leave yourself exposed to this. But as I say, I think it's the absence of strategy is one of the things people have criticized this war from the beginning. There was no plan to provide for those things. I have spoken to lawyers who hold no brief for and have no patience for the genocide claims at the ICJ against Israel, who say they are spurious, who nevertheless say, as a matter of law, and they say it with a very heavy heart, about an Israeli prime minister and an Israeli defense minister, but such is the folly of those decisions and those restrictions that were made on humanitarian aid, that this is where we are. You mentioned that we have a guest, and he is extremely well placed to talk about all these matters.
Yuval Shany is a professor of international law in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a senior fellow in the Israeli Democracy Institute. He was also a former chair of the United Nations Human Rights Committee and these days teaches at King's College in London. Yuval, thank you so much for talking to us today. We've been long awaiting you.
Thank you for having me. I've also waited long.
So we're glad to make this happen. The circumstances are not, let's say, entirely optimistic, but we want to use your expertise just to start with a brief explainer, which is help us understand why this decision of the International Criminal Court is such a significant one.
Well, it is a significant one because, this is effectively the first time in which a leader of a democratic country has been branded as a suspected war criminal or a suspected perpetrator of crimes against humanity by the central and most prestigious organ of the international community that is assigned with the application of international criminal law, and that is the International Criminal Court. We have seen, of course, the court already issuing indictments, but typically the targets of these indictments and arrest warrants were warlords in Africa, dictators in parts of the world, Vladimir Putin. We now see this also with regard to the Hamas leadership, but actually putting the leadership of Israel within the same camp is quite shocking, and not in the joke kind of way where this is exactly the kind of club you don't want to belong in, right?
Just before we get into all the issues that come out of this, I think it's very helpful if you can just sort of straighten us and others out on exactly how this works. So obviously you've said just even by being named in this way, that's a very significant deal. And I know that this is only, all we've had so far is a request from the prosecutor that a warrant be issued, and that has to go through this chamber of judges beforehand. What are the chances, if that does happen, if it does go through and a warrant is issued, what are the chances that either of the two men named, Prime Minister Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant, actually would be arrested somewhere, would actually, face trial somewhere? And even in the absence of that, just sort of talk us through what this would actually mean for the lives of these two people in terms of their ability to move around the world, to travel. Is it the case they can only go to places that don't accept the authority of the international? Just talk us through all those practical points.
Right. So first, one has to say the likelihood that the request would be accepted is quite high. So far in the history of the court, there has been only one case where a request had been denied, and even that request on second attempt has been confirmed. So the likelihood that that this hurdle would prove a significant hurdle for the prosecutor is quite low. And if indeed the court would issue an arrest warrant, the practical implication is that from the court's perspective, the 124 member states are required to implement the arrest warrant, namely that if Gallant, Netanyahu, or the other named suspects set foot inside their territory, they are legally obliged to arrest them and to surrender them to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and then a trial would commence. There is also a possibility that has been tried before, actually, by the leaders of Kenya, who were also facing charges around election violence. That was about a decade ago. And they announced that they would actually voluntarily appear before the court. And in that case, an arrest warrant was deemed unnecessary, but it's not very likely that the Israelis would choose this avenue, because this implies full endorsement of the legitimacy of the court. And as you know, Israel is very much resistant to that. So as a practical matter, Netanyahu and Gallant would not be able to move around these 124 states. And even if a government such as the UK government would provide them certain assurances that they would not be arrested if traveling to London, there is still the odd chance that someone would try to get a court to issue an arrest warrant and basically force the hands of the government to surrender them. And we have seen actually an episode of that nature, ironically, happen with regard to South Africa, where President Bashir, who is another indicted suspect, set foot in South Africa. South Africa refused to surrender him. A court in South Africa commenced hearings on whether he should nonetheless be arrested and extradited. eventually finding that he should be arrested and extradited. But in the interim, South Africa made the necessary preparations to smuggle Bashir out of the country before the domestic order is issued. So in terms of practicality, these 124 countries are effectively out of their travel zone and in perpetuity, because these arrest warrants are not limited in time. They are open in perpetuity.
So, I mean, this is definitely the last 8 months of our lives. We have seen things we would never have imagined. There is an actual realistic option. And you're saying the chances are that if he applied for arrest warrants, that will actually happen. There's an actual possibility that Netanyahu flies somewhere and is arrested, or Defense Minister Gallant?
Yes, there is a very real chance. Already some governments have indicated that this is what they plan to do. Even Germany, who is, a very staunch ally of the state of Israel, has said that we will comply with our legal obligations. And I think it leaves little doubt that it would be highly inadvisable, practically also very embarrassing for the host country to be put in such a situation where they have to choose between their friendship with Israel and their legal obligations as what they would perceive a law-abiding member of the international community. So yes, I mean, this is something that could actually happen.
Yeah, and people have been making the point that even supposedly, as it were, safe countries, like flying from Israel to the United States, gets complicated because what if the plane had to stop in, say, Ireland to be refueled? Suddenly that's a risk. I mean, all these practical things. I want to just get to the case itself. And the heart of the case, when you read it, the detail, the sort of vehemence, the emphasis, in the case of the two Israelis, relates really strongly to Israel's decisions on aid.
Right.
And this the phrase uses the use of starvation as a weapon of war.
Right.
It's also noticeable that the charges are against two political leaders. There had been talk about commanders of the IDF, Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, others being pursued by the ICC. They're not mentioned in this document. It's about the political leaders. Is it wrong to read into that an implication that the prosecutor was ready to, as it were, grant Israel quite a long leash on the fight militarily against Hamas, the bombing, the bombardment, etc. Quite a lot of scope granted there. It was only the decisions on aid that have landed the country on the wrong side of international law.
We have to be a bit cautious here because this is the first set of requests. I mean, no one guarantees that there won't be additional sets of requests. And if we compare this case to the Russian case, we have seen two waves of requests, one involving Putin and then a later request involving two generals who are actually involved in the actual fighting in Ukraine. I wouldn't necessarily read too much into that decision as giving, the IDF some sort of carte blanche or accepting. I would say that with regard to the to the actual conduct of hostilities, questions relating to targets, proportionality, I think the investigation is much more complicated. Because these are extremely difficult, fact-intensive decisions where you have to show not only what happened on the ground, but also what the commanders actually knew about the situation on the ground. And there is also another legal obstacle that the prosecutor faces, and that is the issue of complementarity. That is, that the prosecutor can only introduce a process when there is no credible investigation on the Israeli side. And Israel has taken the position, and we've heard this in the other Hague case only 10 days ago, that Israel is actually conducting an investigation of more than 50 criminal cases, and there are hundreds and hundreds of other incidents that are being reviewed. And as far as we are talking about the military personnel, it's quite obvious that the military system of justice does have jurisdiction with regard to them. It's much less clear whether Netanyahu and Gallant, who have on top of everything also parliamentary immunity, whether the legal system in Israel at this point in time can effectively deal with them with regard to a policy decision that they have taken. But I should also note, and and I realize the answer is a bit lengthy, that the prosecutor's policy has been across the board to target the most high-ranking officials in a state, those allegedly bearing the greatest responsibility. So that might be another reason why he was focusing on the top echelon people and not going further down the chain of command.
That issue of complementarity, that I think two things, they're connected, kind of shocked Israelis in this decision. One is the wrapping together of Hamas leaders who perpetrated this massacre and the democratically elected leaders of Israel. And the other is that Israel, again, is a democratic country and has an independent judiciary. And maybe I'm putting this in layman's terms, but why didn't he believe that Israel is capable of having this investigation independently? And would it help? The Attorney General, former Attorney General Mandelblit said this on the evening news on Channel 12. He said, if you set up an inquiry now, independent commission inquiry, maybe that could help.
Right. Yeah. So with regard to the first point, I tend to agree that this might have been a misstep by the prosecutor. I can see why he went in the direction that he went. He wanted to show that he actually is impartial and he is assigning legal responsibility for all parties to the conflict that have violated the legal obligation. I should say that the allegations against Hamas are very serious allegations. Mm-hmm. By actually piling the two sets of cases into one request, I do think that he did convey this unfortunate message of equivalency, moral equivalency, legal equivalency. And he has been heavily criticized by even traditional supporters of the court for that. And I think there could have been more sophisticated ways to move forward while indicating that he will deal in due course with the other party as well. So that was probably a misstep. With regard to complementarity, to the best of my knowledge, and we also know this from the statement of Blinken, actually the Israelis were in contact with his office and were actually negotiating perhaps another visit by the prosecutor in order to provide some information on what Israel is doing with regard to investigations. But the thing is, in order to claim complementarity, it's not enough to say in general that you have a functioning legal system. You have to show that the factual pattern which serves as the basis of the charges has been actively and effectively dealt by with the legal system. And whereas we know that with regard to specific bombing operations and mistreatment of detainees and other things of that nature, the system has been operationalized. There has been no information provided in public. There may exist such an information, but I'm not aware of it, that questions relating to the humanitarian aid policy were reviewed in ways that could eventually lead to criminal charges. I should say that one issue that would, I guess, be raised during the proceedings, if and when we get there, is what do we make of the fact that the High Court of Justice is actually reviewing the legality of the humanitarian aid policy. This is, of course, not a criminal investigation. This is an administrative law investigation, but I would imagine that Israeli lawyers or lawyers representing the interest of the two suspects would say that this is perhaps the gateway to eventual legal proceedings. And we have seen in the past that decisions by Bagatz, by the High Court of Justice, did eventually also lead to criminal investigations. So this is where we at. With regard to Mandelbligt's approach, I tend to agree. It's not too late. If Israel can demonstrate at this point in time that it is serious and it is wishing to exercise its legal right to invoke complementarity by independently, credibly, effectively investigating the facts that underlay the charges, for instance, by establishing an independent commission of inquiry, this could still, I think, apply. It would certainly very much complicate the ability of the prosecutor to proceed with the case.
It is one of the great ironies of this story if the thing that in the end helps Benjamin Netanyahu off the hook is his ability to point to the existence of a strong, independent Supreme Court in his country, given the whole of pre-October 7th, 2023 was dominated by his attempt to weaken Israel's strong, independent streets.
We've already seen this with Aaron Barak being called from retirement to save a little bit in Israel in the other court at The Hague. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Indeed. But the thing I wanted to ask you about was, and it's hard to do this because obviously the whole thing, people talk about international law and say in a way it's sort of politics always anyway, but is there a way to assess in purely legal terms, not whatever political, views people bring to this, the merit as a lawyer of the charge sheet, as it were? Does it stack up? Has the prosecutor, Karim Khan, presented a strong case, particularly on the point we're focusing on this area of humanitarian aid, what he alleges, which is starvation as a weapon of war? Is it legally strong?
Well, that's the used to be $64,000 question before devaluation. So that's the big question, right? So frankly, we don't know, because so far we have seen a very short statement by the prosecutor, and we have seen also a short report by a quite impressive panel of experts that he gathered together to provide some support and credibility to the exercise, which I should say this is unprecedented. It's never been done before. And it actually underscores maybe the political sensitivity of this particular charge. If we look at the case based on what we know, which is mostly open source information, we know that the policies on humanitarian aid have been very problematic, both in terms of statements that were made very early on, using very strong language on complete siege, and also with regard to many criticisms that have been leveled, including by friendly governments such as the US and the UK, with regard to the pace in which aid was introduced. And of course, the situation on the ground, where you have this very long string of UN and NGO reports that suggest that the food situation, that humanitarian conditions have been catastrophic. Is this enough to show intent, special intent to starve? For this, the prosecutor, I think, would have to work quite hard, and it will also have to confront some maybe inconvenient facts for his narrative, and that is that, yes, there have been many problems with the humanitarian aid policy. Some of them could be explained away by other reasons than intending to starve the population. For instance, if you impose a siege on northern Gaza, the laws of siege may permit you to basically restrict access to humanitarian aid in the north, provided that there is safe access for civilians towards the south, where you are supposed to allow for access to humanitarian aid. Another issue would be the question of the responsiveness of the Israeli government. So if the Israelis can show a pattern by which when this information came forward that the situation deteriorates, the response has been opening up more crossing points, introducing more aid into the strip, more trucks. This, I think, doesn't sit well with an intent to starve the population. So I think you are confronted here with two very different narratives. I would say that in hindsight, the policy, even if it's not criminally unlawful, does not appear to have been morally sustainable, and certainly not politically wise, because it did generate this huge moral outrage, again, including from Israel's closest allies, which in the end complicated the military action to a great deal. So even if this is not a case of acting patently unlawful, and again, this is, again, when we're talking about a criminal case, the threshold is particularly high, and a special intent crime, this has certainly not have been a very Israel's finest hour in terms of applying its strategic assets. We've always taught and learned that when you go to war, legitimacy, international legitimacy is a very important asset that you want to keep. And here this was blown away for a set of policy decisions that in hindsight do not make sense, and were in fact fully reversed in the end, because now the policy is that Israel is flooding the Gaza Strip with humanitarian aid. So it didn't even withstand this relatively short test of time.
This is a very important conversation that we're having, and it's very deep and it's erudite, but we're living in the, bullpit of Twitter. And in that regard, even if the arrest warrants don't go forward, the words Israel and genocide, the words Israel and starvation, they're already out there. And I wonder I know maybe this is more on a diplomatic or a political or international level, but what is the impact for all Israelis, not just Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, of all that we are talking about now?
No, I mean, this is, we're talking about Yom Kippur Tzvai. This is a Yom Kippur Medini, right? A political or diplomatic disaster. Some of the charges, I would say, are hyperbolic. Certainly the language that is used and the legal categories. Certainly politically motivated by many actors. But at the end of the day, you have to convince, when you're talking about diplomacy, you have to convince the rest of the world that you're acting reasonably. And here I would say that the combination of a very bloody conflict, very aggressive statements, and also limited trust in the good faith of the Israeli leadership, given the composition of the government and the track record of some people on the government, really drove us into a sort of a diplomatic and political corrales, right? Where this is going to affect very severely Israel for years to come, unless, Israel is able, like other countries have been able, to somehow bounce back by, maybe changing leadership, changing its tone, adopting a more reconciliatory approach towards the conflict. So I do feel that we have been moving towards a diplomatic and political and also security dead end. And these are some of the implications of reaching the end of the road in that regard. I'm sorry to sound so negative, Yonit.
No, don't worry. You fit right in on Unholy
in our mood here.
In recent weeks.
Yeah.
But Yonit's mention of the sort of bear pit of social media prompts this thought in my mind. You've heard the following from a lot of defenders of Israel on social media, which is that the unfairness of this is that here is Netanyahu and Gallant, leaders in a democratic country. All they have been, people on Twitter, etc., have been listing all the terrible crimes that have been committed that never caught the attention, as it were, of the ICC. He's not here. You're going to have to channel his voice if you were. But if Karim Khan was here on this conversation, what would he say is the reason why he's issued this request against Netanyahu and Gallant, but his court never did the same for, Assad of Syria and so on?
Well, I mean, there are jurisdictional issues. I mean, the court doesn't have unlimited power. It can only exercise its authority with regard to territories or citizens of states which have accepted its jurisdiction or where it got a Security Council authorization. So with regard to Assad, simply the legal conditions that allow the court to operate were not there. And he would say, I mean, he has charged Putin. This is not, so this he actually aimed higher than, and in fairness, the court did look into criminal responsibility also of members of the armed forces in the UK with regard to Iraq and members of the armed forces of the United States with regard to Afghanistan. But both of these countries were able, maybe using, we are not the United States, Israel. We are also not the United Kingdom. They were able to demonstrate to the court, and in the UK, that was the most significant dimension, that there was a serious investigation that met international standards. And this is why it went away. In Israel, on that specific issue, given the amount of attention that it has generated, Israel was not able to basically demonstrate the same kind of internal investigation. So saying you are a democracy does give you, I guess, some credit, but it doesn't, the prosecutor would say it doesn't really take you completely off the hook. You still have to basically, it's an ongoing project. You have to show that you are making an effort to actually hold to account those who have allegedly violated international law. I mean, so this is what Karim Khan would say. Now, I would say that, of course, there are some political considerations. The prosecutor has been the whole court has been extremely criticized by African countries, that it is targeting almost exclusively black defendants, and some say it should basically change the name to the court of the court to ICCA, International Criminal Court for Africa. And I think both the Putin charge and also the Netanyahu and Gallant charge are part also of that discourse. So it is actually a more complicated game. I don't think that the prosecutor was set out initially to get Israel. I mean, he visited Israel. Actually, his first statements were criticized by pro-Palestinian groups as being too lenient on Israel and being too harsh on Hamas. So he was playing a delicate game. I guess for this specific offense, he felt that he has enough to go on, given the level of, like I said before, moral outrage and some of the statements that actually tied specific individuals, high-ranking individuals, to these specific policies. This is, by the way, what he also did with Putin. He actually tied him to the offense of transferring children from Ukraine to Russia on the basis of explicit statements that he had made in that regard.
You know, we're talking, it's just before noon on a Thursday, and the news just broke that we're talking a lot about the ICC, but that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, will rule tomorrow, 4:00 Israel time, on the request to halt Israel's Rafah offensive in Gaza. So let's talk a little bit about that request and what happens if Israel doesn't adhere to the request and actually continues the war.
So it's not a request, it's an order. This is how it's a provisional measures order, and Israel is legally obliged to comply with orders of the International Court of Justice. This is the legal position. I mean, there have been some voices which I've heard in Israel which have questioned this by saying, well, we have a right to self-defense and this right trumps everything else. But this would be a very, aggressive and adventurous interpretation of existing international law. Implementation, however, is a very different issue. I mean, it's the same court, if you recall, and I'm apologizing for making this comparison all the time, but it's the same court that ordered Russia to stop the special military operation in Ukraine. And as we recall, Russia did not comply with these provisional measures. So the question of compliance is, of course, a very different ballgame. And in practical terms, decisions of the International Court of Justice have never been enforced by any international body. It's the job of the Security Council to enforce such decisions. And it's quite unlikely that the Security Council, as long as Israel enjoys America's back, it's quite unlikely that the Security Council would enforce such a decision. But this would be another layer of complications, because other countries who are perhaps, again, mindful not only of their friendship with Israel, but also of the need to uphold the authority of international law, might find themselves in an impossible situation, continuing to support the Israeli war effort diplomatically, but also militarily, to the extent that they export military equipment to Israel. It's not going to be a walk in the park, to put it very, very mildly. We'll have to see, of course, what the court decides. I mean, the case for stopping the war in Rafah is, I would say, also for the court, would be taking somewhat of a leap, given the fact that almost no one contests the fact that Israel has a right to self-defense here, and that it is using force in order to protect the lives of its citizens and rescue its hostages. So for the court to actually stop the war would be, I guess, quite a dramatic decision. And for this, it would have to, again, become convinced that the humanitarian situation in the Rafah area has really reached catastrophic levels that leave the court no choice in that regard.
What does it mean in both these arenas, ICC and the ICJ, that Israel does have the backing of a big player in the form of the United States? Joe Biden, straight away after the request from the ICC prosecutors, said this is outrageous. Apart from, making you feel better and a sort of comfort, is there anything that in practical terms, that kind of support gives you if you're Israel, it gives you if you're Netanyahu, or is the law, and that he's now, in both these two different arenas on the wrong side of it?
Well, I mean, of course, the United States is an important actor because, first and foremost, it can veto Security Council resolutions. And this is something which only 4 other countries around the world can do. For the courts, especially the ICC, it is also important to be on the United States' good side, because the court is often relying on diplomacy and relying on also financial support from other countries. And in that regard, the United States often leads the way. So even though the United States is not a member state of the Rome Statute, is not a party to the court, it's been very supportive of the prosecutors' investigations in Ukraine, and actually also supported financially those investigations. So for the court now to basically have a rupture with the United States could actually complicate its ability to obtain, for instance, intelligence operation from U.S. intelligence agencies, basically to leverage U.S. diplomatic influence in order to get other states to cooperate, and also to obtain financial resources from the UN and other agencies. I would say that during the Trump years, when the United States itself was under investigation, we have seen a more radical response, and that is the imposition of personal sanctions, including travel restrictions and freezing of bank accounts on ICC prosecutors. And there are already calls in Congress to basically go back to that playbook and target the current prosecutor and his team. I'm not sure that this current administration would go in that direction, but certainly if a new administration sets camp in Washington after November, we would certainly be hearing these sort of voices much more forcefully.
Professor Yuval Shany, we've learned a lot from this conversation. I was going to ask you for optimism, but that might have to wait for a future conversation between us. But we thank you very, very much for coming on Unholy.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So Professor Yuval Shany, who's brilliant on international law, and we've wanted to have him on for a very long time. I'm really glad that happened. It was a very smart analysis of what is going on in Israel's situation, what it can do to still maybe turn some of this around, perhaps. I think that we should, if we are talking about this sort of diplomatic failure, then we should probably add to that the fact that Norway, Ireland, and Spain said they will recognize a Palestinian state. This is obviously a declarative move. It doesn't have that much of a difference. It doesn't make much of a difference. But of course, when you look at it in context, look, I just want to make this point. I know that our listeners are probably very knowledgeable in all of the history of this, but Israel did want to go towards an idea of a Palestinian state. The way that it has been stepped on and hindered each time was because of Hamas. And to think of the fact that the Israeli logic here is, under these circumstances, to have a Palestinian state now, not that that is a realistic possibility, but that is, again, in Israeli eyes, sending a message that Hamas's horrific actions are in any way rewarded. And the road to diplomatic change has to go through a terrible event like this. So that is something to note just on the level of what Israelis are hearing and feeling right now.
Yeah, I can imagine that is how that plays. I would just push back on one point that, that Israel was so eager to get a two-state solution. It was Hamas who blocked it. Israel, by its own actions in the Netanyahu period, has made the actual practicality of a two-state solution ever more difficult, if not impossible, by the expansion of settlements, by going beyond what would previously understood as settlement blocks that would be part of any kind of deal, and instead making the actual business of a contiguous, viable Palestinian state more and more impractical. That has been...
Oslo obviously started in 1993. Netanyahu was elected for a very long period in 2009. I'm ignoring for a moment the 1996 election of him. So, yeah, but there's obviously a different...
Oh, you're talking about in the pre-Netanyahu period?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. No, well, then I think we can agree on that much more, although settlements were carried on in the Oslo period too. We can litigate that at round and round. But on your point about the diplomatic moves, just a small example of that, the sense of isolation. Football fans will have noted that Israel has games coming up against, for example, Scotland, and the decision has been taken on security grounds that game be played behind closed doors without any fans present. Obviously people thinking that such a game could be interrupted by protests or worse or something violent, but just another example of how this is leading to a sense of isolation around Israel, which will be painful for those people who thought the whole point of, Israel was that Jews would be part of the family of nations rather than sort of distanced from it, which is what this is about. Now, despite all of that, we do carry on and we do maintain our traditions steadfastly. And one of them on this podcast is award time. And so we will hand out our Chutzpah Award, a story we haven't paid sufficient attention to just because there's so much going on. People will remember that the week began with the death in a helicopter crash of the president of Iran. I mean, normally that would have been the dominant story of the week. We're not suggesting that in any way that he is the recipient of the Chutzpah Award. Rather, international leaders, including the United Nations, who suggested a moment of silence for and sort of commemoration of the life of Ibrahim Raisi, president of Iran, who was known by certainly the freedom and democracy protesters in that country as the Butcher of Tehran for the oppression that he meted out to the people of Iran. And yet somehow he was given the sort of black-bordered send-off by international leaders. It struck our nominating committee's ears as a bit of a chutzpah to treat, as we say, the man reviled as the Butcher of Tehran, that kind of respect.
Yes, I mean, in his biography, it's noted that he oversaw the mass executions of thousands of Iranians. In the late 80s, you could have seen the celebrations of, expats of Iran around the world after he was, and even inside Iran, after he died in this helicopter crash. So to have this sort of moment of silence for this man is, yes, I think it deserves something of a chutzpah award. Can I do the match then?
You can.
You took that.
All yours.
So this comes to us in our email box, a good opportunity to tell our listeners that we really appreciate the emails they send us and the messages. We go through them all. And we found this from Randy Katzka in Scarsdale, New York. I really hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. And if not, please do correct me, Randy. But he wrote us that he says, I'm a 55-year-old father, husband, physician, and runner. And that in January, he started a local running group that wanted to find some sort of meaning in what happened in October 7th. These are my words. His words are, I wanted to keep the 132 hostages in the mind of the runners. So I ran 132 kilometers, which is 82 miles, at my first ultra marathon. And he also sent us pictures, we should say, and we're really appreciative of that. We just think it's something, and we talked about this a lot, Jonathan, in the days and weeks after October 7th, that attempt to try and find meaning and try to work out everything that you are feeling and your emotions and what to do with that, and any way that can sort of help or bring into the world's consciousness what happened and how to still help. I think that running, signifying the hostages. Sadly, we are now at 128 hostages because 4 bodies have been retrieved and brought back to Israel this week as well. But just that thinking of how to make that into something that can help, can bring it into the headlines. So I thought that he deserved the Mensch Award of the week.
Very, very much so. And Randy got in touch with us by email. You can do that too. It is 2jewsonthenews@gmail.com. You can also contact us via Facebook and Instagram. Our accounts there are @UnholyPodcast. We do always appreciate hearing from you.
Oh, look at you social media whiz. Okay, thanks. Thank you for listening to this show as well. And Jonathan, we will see each other next week. Thank you to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, and Omri Barak. And as I said, we'll meet next week.
See you then.